textures is they are absolutely timeless. So a texture that looks great now is going to continue to look great 20 years from now. You can't really say that about every design resource because trends and looks and styles kind of come and go. But textures truly is a medium that is timeless because it's based off of nature. The second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy, things go from order to disorder and decay. So that's why textures are going to continue to look good whether you use them now or 20 years down the line on another project. So in this movie, I want to walk you through my creative process, how I use and create an illustration using textures, specifically the texture brush, the texture bus textures set. And I like to use Illustrator as somewhat of a staging ground to compose my textures. And I'll also use Photoshop, as you're going to see, to add and create additional textures within my design. But it's somewhat unorthodox. And along with this set, I provide you with the vector texture equivalent for each of the textures in the set. But I prefer to use the raster files within the context of Illustrator, even though they're not vector. Just because it's a vector program doesn't mean you need to use vectors all the time. As you're going to see, you're going to get incredible results by just composing and layering textures and utilizing them within your work. So let's get started. In the creative process for me, it all starts in analog, all starts in drawing. And it's been about 10 years since I had illustrated an owl. And so I decided to reapproach that theme with this illustration. And anytime I'm creating artwork for the sake of demonstrating something, I always pick a theme I like or I want to do. Otherwise, what's the point? That makes it a whole lot funner and more sustainable if you do things you like. So with this drawing, if I zoom in on it, a lot of this owl is symmetric, meaning his head, I don't have to rebuild the eye and the brow of this figure. It can all be built on one side, and then I'll use the reflection tool to flip it over. So it all starts with my base vector shapes, and I like to focus on form and shape of my vectors based on the underlying drawing. The underlying drawing really makes the process easier, removes all the guesswork, and I just create my fundamental base vector shapes to compose the entire illustration as shown here. And once again, some of these elements are symmetric, such as the brow, so I only had to build one of these and clone and flip it to get the other side. The same with his eyes and elements in his beak. So that's how I did that. Everything else is just simple, basic vector building. There's nothing complicated here. It just takes time to work it all out. Now, what you can't really see in my sketch, it's pretty faint in my sketch. If I zoom in here, you can see the faint outline of kind of branches in the background. So I work those out too. And I built those as well as a second component. Now this is going to act as if it's branches further in the tree that is kind of more in the distance, and thus will be a secondary element just to add some nice depth, dimension, and interest to the overall illustration. So where textures come into play is once we start colorizing our artwork. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn on all the layers regarding the color for this design, and we'll go ahead and do that here. So you can see on the background branches here, this is just a vector shape that I have set to Gaussian blur to kind of push it back like it's fading in the background. The branches in the foreground are in sharp focus. The moon itself is also a vector shape, just Gaussian blurred as well. And then I'm going to go up here and just turn on all the base vector shapes that make up this character. And I believe that's it right there. So this is all of what I consider my base vector artwork. Now let me zoom in on this character and some of the detail you can see here. You can see I have some of this kind of grainy shading in here. And this is actually another Retro Supply Company product. You can check this out if you want to. It's called the Organic Vector Brush Pack from Retro Supply. And this specific texture is included in that pack. There's different courses. So this is the finer course one, but there's a more kind of chunkier, grainier course. But for this one, I wanted it a little finer. And so I've used that just to create some simple shading on this character, on his brow, and other areas, just to start to add a little bit of dimension and depth and bring some of that organic element into this illustration. I love vector art. I love the flexibility of vector art, but at times it can get too sharp, too clean, and that's why I love textures. Textures bring what I call humanity to vector art. So we're going to start with texturizing this. In the first place, we're going to go, and I should point out, if you look at my layers over here, I've really taken the time to layer my illustration. So the head's on its own layer, I have the brow on its own layer, and all these I can toggle on and off and isolate different areas, and that's how I do that type of shading, in this case with the grain texture. Now I'm going to use this same kind of methodology when I move forward and I start to texturize things. It's really important to use layers in such a way so you can help manage and build up one layer upon another to get the effect you want. So the first one we're going to do is an edge texture effect. And once again, all these textures are from the texture bus set. And this specific texture, if I click on it here, and we're going to go ahead and go to Windows, and I'm going to open up links just to show you something. And we'll bring that up, and you can see that this specific texture is the juvenile delinquent one. I had fun with the names, by the way, on this texture bus set for the texture bus. I used all these names that are associated with basically high school, and I tried to use the negative connotation ones because textures are degraded and falling apart. So I was just kind of playing off of that for the concept. So even with the names, it'll help you remember ones that you like, because more than likely you're going to have favorites and use certain ones over and over again. I know I do that when it comes to textures. Now on this one, the texture is called juvenile delinquent, but notice I have variant at the end of its name. That's because I've gone ahead, and we'll go ahead and minimize this window and bring it over here. I've actually broken that one texture into two parts, and I just did that by taking the resource file that I provide and going into Photoshop and just cutting it down the middle. And I did this so that I could take this texture and basically compose it and control it exactly where I wanted to. So on these, I'm just going to slide them over into place, and the way I'm using these textures specifically is I'm just using it to break up this clean, kind of this clean edge. So I'm going to select both of these now, color them white. And on this one, I don't want the opacity 100%. We'll go 35, and that looks good. And it's just to break up that kind of flatness of the illustration and start to infuse it with this nice texture. So that's the first one I'm going to do. The second one I'm going to do is, it's another one of the textures. And on this one, if I open up the links and select it, you can see this one's called Peachy. And once again, it's a variant. Now this is one texture in the set, but I've taken that one texture and I've actually broken it into three parts. So I have one down the bottom left corner here, one on the right edge here in bottom right corner, and one at the top. So it's one texture that I've once again taken it into Photoshop and broken it apart just so I could control it a little more. And on this one, we're going to go ahead and select these. All these will have the same color and opacity. And once again, we'll color them white. And I don't want the value too much, so I'm going to go 70. And we'll go OK. So you can see how we're layering one texture upon another texture to slowly build up that nice organic flair to this illustration. Now, textures just don't apply to flat areas. They can also play an illustrative role if you're doing an illustration, that is. And so this first one I'm going to do is, this is a texture here. If we go to links and I show you, it's Bad Grades is the name of this one. And on this texture, I've just placed it and I've rotated it to overlap all the areas of this branch here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and set this to white like this. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the opacity. I want this pretty faint, so we're going to go to 25. And then I'm going to select a clone of the branch, the outer area, the outer shape of the branch is going to become the mask. So I'm going to select that, and I'm going to go ahead and mask it. Now, on my workstation, I have mask set up as the F1 key. So I can select a mask, select the layer underneath it, hit F1, and it masks it into that shape. And then once I have it masked into that shape, I don't want it sticking out on these edges here. So I have the outer edge of my design set up here with this box that's going to serve as another mask. And I'll select the mask I just did with this new shape, and I'll go ahead and mask this. So F1 again. If you don't know where mask is, it's just Object, Clipping Mask, Make, but you can see I have F1 assigned to it. Keyboard shortcuts really cuts down the build time if you get in the habit of using that. So this adds a nice, begins to kind of build up and add some nice texturing on the branch, just to give it that modeling that an actual branch would have without doing a whole lot of work. The texture is doing all the creative heavy lifting in terms of the detailing on this branch. That's why I love using this process. Now we're going to do the same effect again with the same texture. We've just rotated the texture 180 degrees. And on this one, we're going to colorize it this muted green here in the swatches panel. So I'll go ahead and fill it with that. And by the way, these are bitmap TIFFs. So the white background on these textured TIFF images are automatically by default transparent when you place into Illustrator. That's why I love using bitmap TIFFs. Way easier to use. If this was, for instance, a vector file, you'd be dealing with thousands and thousands of anchor points, and it really bogs down a machine. And as you're going to see when it's all said and done, you really don't need to do that. So I've colored it this muted green now. Now I'm going to go to blend mode in transparency palette, and I'm going to set it to overlay. And then I'm going to adjust the value. I don't want it to be this intense. I want it to be a little more muted. So we'll go 40. And once again, I'll select a mask shape of the branches itself. F1 to mask it. And now I don't want this sticking out on the edge. So once again, I have this outer shape defined, and I'm going to select that with the one I just masked, and we'll mask it again, F1. And if I zoom in on this, you can see the nice modeling effect. And if we really zoom in, you can see how there's a lot of different little levels of detail and colorization change as it goes over the surface. And that's why I like using textures. It gives that illusion, that illustrative illusion of that surface of bark and the branch. That's why I wanted to do that. So that's how I went ahead and handled textures on the branch. We'll keep moving forward here. We're going to add a little bit of atmosphere, and this is just simply one of the textures here that's been placed. If I select that, this one is called Varsity, and so I've just selected this texture, placed it. We'll colorize it white, and on this one I don't want the value too high. And the reason why I pick that is, notice in this texture has these long stringy kind of scrapes, and it kind of acts like once the opacity is set, you kind of get that feel of branches, especially as I build up the other textures. That's why I added that one in here. Now, it's at this point that I like how this is going, but I don't like the edge still. It's too sharp, it's too straight, it's too perfect. I want it to be a very texturized, broken up edge. And this is where you can take these textures and you can go into Photoshop and you can do additional work using the texture brushes provided in the set. So we're going to switch to Illustrator now. So I'll go ahead and switch over to Photoshop, not Illustrator. We'll switch to Photoshop. Make sure we have it open. And all I've done is I've brought my base artwork into Photoshop. It's at 100%. It's sized exactly the way it is in Illustrator. I've just included an additional space around it so that the texture will cover and overlap that edge. And once again, this is just simply my illustration brought in, and on a layer above it, this is where we're going to start using some texture brushes. So we're going to open up the brush presets here, and you can see some of the textures from the texture bus set are already loaded in here. And we're going to go ahead and come over here and pick the paintbrush. You can see this is way too big, so we'll want to scale it down. You can hold Control Option and just drag to scale the brush down or up. And so once you get it, whatever color you have loaded in your foreground is what it's going to paint. We're on a layer above it that's transparent. And this is where I'll just start experimenting. For this one, I'll just start kind of breaking up this edge. And there's a lot you can do with brushes in terms of making it randomized so it rotates or shifts or sizes or scales as you're using it. And so you can handle it this way. For this, I'm just going through and just kind of eyeballing just some of the texture in with this one. We'll switch to another one here. So we'll go down to this one. Once again, too big, so we'll scale this one down as well. And this is where it just gets really fun. And you can just experiment and just play with it, see what looks good, select another one. Once again, too big. And I purposely made these brushes big so you can scale them down and use them almost on any project. It does no good when you get a texture brush and by default it's like this big. It doesn't make usability that great on certain things, especially larger uses. So I try to give them provide them in a large format that allows people more flexibility to size and scale and use them the way they want to use them. So I'm just going to take this, and you can see how you can add texture. Already it's starting to break up nicely. And I would just go through and I would start picking other textures. Maybe we grab this one and scale this one down. This one does look really good when you place it in the corner. It really blows out stuff really nicely. And the nice thing about textures is as you build your collection of different texture sets, you can use all of them together because they tend to work together really well, whether they're the exact set or not. So you can see I have a lot of textures in here that I've created for other projects that I use all the time. And I can blend, mix, and match them. Now, everything you see on screen now was only with this set by Retro Supply Company. And like a good cooking show, I kind of have a few things pre-baked, so I'm going to turn this layer off. But that's the process I went through to do what I'm going to show you now. And this is the textured vignette that I created using the brushes in this set. Now, as I'm creating, if I'm unsure about something, it's okay to have a layer above it. And so I'll turn this on. You can see how I've added additional details. Once I've have it the way I want, I tend to just select this layer and we go to merge down and I merge it with the layer below. Now, if I ever want to make an edit, I'll create another layer above it like this, and I'll just paint in black. So these represent areas I want to knock through. I think there's too much white in these areas and they need to be kind of diminished a little bit. So I'll just hold Command down, make a selection of this layer, turn this layer off, go to the layer that I've merged, and then just hit delete. And this just deletes that texture out of this other texture. And that's how I'll just do it until visually it feels right. It looks right. It's the way, the look and feel I'm going after. And when it's all said and done, I'll just make another selection of the final composition of that texture in black, and then I'll just save out a bitmap TIFF from this file. Now I always save my layered file as I'm working, so if I ever want to go back and edit something or try something, I can report out an image anytime. So this is the one that I've saved in a bitmap TIFF format, so we're going to switch back to Illustrator and place it and finish out the illustration. You'll see how it all comes together and works very well. So we'll go ahead and go back to Illustrator now. And we're on this layer right here, which is textured vignette. And we're going to go ahead and place that texture we created in Photoshop. So we'll find that on the desktop here, and I'll go place. Now I'm going to go to align, make sure we're on alignment to artboard. And then because I have this centered, I don't need to drag it. I can just use alignment to get it exactly in the place I want. And on this one, we want it full strength white. I'll color it white. And check out how nice that vignettes our whole illustration. It really breaks up the edge. It looks nice and authentic. Now, if I go to keyline view at this point, it kind of looks like a mess. And this is why I like to say I like to use Illustrator as a staging ground. I don't care if it looks like a mess. If it comes out making the art look the way I intend it, that's all that matters. I would never give a client this file as the final art. I would rasterize it when I'm all said and done. So we have a few more textures we're going to add here. The next one is going to be this texture, and this texture is Truant Officer. And on this one, we're just going to colorize it this light blue. Now, the whole reason I'm doing this is in the context of illustration, the more different, all colors merge and create other colors. So because this has so much blue in it, some of that blue needs to come into the owl in even a subtle way just to make it a little more believable. So that's why I'm doing this. I'm going to switch to blend mode of multiply. And the value I'm going to change to 30% opacity just to get those ever so subtle shades of blue kind of cascading through that color, overwhelming color of brown. It just helps add some authenticity to it. Now, the next one we're going to do is another variant. If I select this one, this texture, just a nice speckling, this is the play hooky texture. Now this is a variant because if you open up that texture in the set, it does not look like this. Part of it does, and what I did is I focused on that one part, and in Photoshop, I just cloned in that same grainy kind of speckling throughout the entire image and then saved it out as a new texture. And that's the beauty of these. You can do that to grow the set however you want. Not only that, you can go get the original source photography that I include in this set and bake your own texture if you don't like how I simplified it down. So lots of flexibility on how you can work with it. And this is one way. And I did this because this is fall, this is winter. I want this to have a cold kind of feeling to it. And so I wanted to use this texture as a way to kind of bring some elements into it. Now, initially with this one, I'm not going to color it white like I am really soon. I'm going to select this and I'm going to go ahead and color it brown because what I want to do with this one is I'm going to use this one. We'll change the blend mode to multiply and we'll set the opacity to 25. And on this one, I just want the speckling, we'll zoom in on the owl, to run through the owl to bring some of that organic speckling into the owl. I have the outline of the owl established for the mask, and once again I can hit F1 key just to mask that texture only within the confines of the owl. That's why I did that. I wanted to limit that texture to that area alone. Now this same texture, the variant of the, what was it called? Play hooky, we're going to add now as white. So you can see the same texture here. And we're going to just turn this one to white. And on this one, we're going to color this. I don't want it completely opaque, so we'll just add a 25% opacity. And that runs over the entire image to add this nice little flecks of white throughout. And that's to help reflect snow that's in the air that's falling down. We're going to continue to reinforce that idea with the next one. And once again, it's the same texture. I'm using the same texture 3 times here. And once again, we'll go ahead and color this white as well. And on this one, I want the opacity to be a little more apparent since it's a little bigger too, and that's 40. And that continues to give that snow feel effect going here. And the last part of this illustration that really brings it to life, let's go ahead and zoom in on this illustration so you can see it a little better here on screen, is the last element is we're going to turn on what's called bokeh. Now, if you're not familiar with this, this is like if you go out and shoot photographs and the flash goes off and there's dust particles in the air or snowflakes. It tends to make those really geometric, usually round orbs that are out of focus, and that's what we did here in order to act like snow. Now, what's really going to bring this to life, though, on this one is actually what I need to do is I should have had all of these grouped together, but what I'm going to do is just select these, and we're going to make the opacity 50%. And then I'm going to have to turn everything back on. It's kind of sloppy. I should have planned that a little better, but oh well, here we go. And there we go. We have everything in place. You can see how those out of focus snowflakes really add a nice dimension and allure to the final illustration. So whether you prefer working in Photoshop or Illustrator, you'll be able to take these textures and create incredible results with them. And if you want to bake your own, once again, just access the original source photos and see what you can create with them and use on your next project. Now, of course, I'd never give a client this file because this is what it looks like if you go into Keyline View. I would take this file and I would rasterize it as a high-res TIFF image and provide that to the client instead, and it's going to look just as great as you see here on screen. So hope you like the textures. Look forward to seeing what you create with them.